The January wind cut through Chicago like a blade, and Maria Gonzalez felt every degree of it seeping through her worn coat. She had been standing in this line for 3 hours now, her feet numb inside shoes that had walked too many miles, cleaned too many floors. The bank's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, institutional glow that made everyone look sick. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clutching the manila envelope that held her entire future. Inside were medical bills that had grown like a tumor, each one stamped with increasing urgency. Her mother's diabetes had worsened, and the medications that kept her alive cost more than Maria made in 2 weeks of scrubbing office buildings before dawn. The woman ahead of her complained loudly into her phone about the wait, about incompetent staff, about how her time was valuable. Maria said nothing. She never said anything. Speaking up felt like taking space that didn't belong to her, like claiming attention she hadn't earned. Her phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor. "Maria, my grandson needs money for school books. Can you help?" Below that, another message from Roberto down the hall. "Emergency with my truck. Just $50 until Friday." Maria's thumb hovered over the keyboard. Her savings account had exactly $112. After today's loan application, if it went through, maybe she could help them. Maybe she could stretch it. She always stretched it. She typed back, "Let me see what I can do." The line moved forward an inch. A baby cried somewhere behind her, and Maria turned instinctively, offering a gentle smile to the exhausted young mother. The woman didn't notice. Nobody ever noticed Maria unless they needed something from her. Her supervisor had called that morning, voice tight with forced sympathy. "Maria, we're cutting hours across the board. Just temporarily, you understand." She understood. She always understood. She'd work the reduced schedule, smile, say thank you for whatever she was given. The loan officer would ask her about collateral. She had none. About credit history. It was thin, punctured with late payments from the months she'd chosen groceries for the neighbors' kids over her own bills. About guarantors. She had no one who could vouch for her financial stability, but she'd sit in that chair anyway, hands folded in her lap, speaking quietly about her mother's insulin, about the way the old woman's hands shook when she tried to count out pills. She'd explain with the patience of someone accustomed to not being heard the first time. Maria pulled her coat tighter. The woman in front of her tapped her manicured nails against her designer purse, each click echoing like tiny hammers. Behind her, conversations swirled in languages she recognized but couldn't speak. Voices carried the same undertone of desperation, wrapped in hope. She thought about the envelope in her hands. Inside, along with the medical bills, was a letter she'd written and rewritten 7 times. A simple explanation of her situation, her work history, her promise to pay back every penny. She'd practiced reading it aloud in her tiny apartment, her voice barely above a whisper so the neighbors wouldn't hear. The security guard glanced at his watch. The bank would close in an hour. Maria counted the people ahead of her. 14. She might make it. She had to make it. Her mother was waiting at home, pretending to sleep so Maria wouldn't worry about the pain that kept her awake. Tomorrow, Maria would wake at 4:30, just like always, and clean other people's spaces until her own hands were raw. But today, she stood in line, holding hope in a manila envelope, believing that somewhere in this cold building was someone who might say yes to a woman who had spent her life saying yes to everyone else. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as Maria finally reached the teller window. Her palms were damp, despite the cold that had settled into her bones. The young man behind the glass looked at her with the polite disinterest of someone who had processed hundreds of hopeless applications. "I need to speak with a loan officer," Maria said, her voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the bank. She slid her envelope through the slot, watching as he flipped through her carefully organized documents with the speed of someone who had already made up his mind. "Mrs. Gonzalez, your appointment was for 10:30. It's now 1:15. He didn't look up from her papers. "Mr. Patterson has gone to lunch." The weight of those 3 hours in line pressed down on her shoulders. Could I wait for him to return? Please. The teller glanced at a computer screen, his fingers dancing across keys that might as well have been typing her rejection. He's booked solid for the rest of the day. We can schedule you for next Wednesday. Next Wednesday. Her mother's prescription would run out on Friday. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came when the world squeezed just a little tighter around her. She wanted to explain about the insulin, about the way her mother tried to ration the pills when money was short, about the fear that lived in both their hearts. But explanations required space, and space required permission she didn't have. Could you check if anyone else might have a few minutes? I can wait however long. Ma'am, I understand your situation, but our loan officers work by appointment only. His voice carried the practiced patience of customer service, hollow and efficient. The earliest I can get you in is next Wednesday at 3:45. Maria nodded, accepting defeat with the grace of someone who had learned that resistance only made things harder. She gathered her papers, each movement deliberate and careful, as if haste might somehow make her appear more desperate than she already was. As she turned away from the window, the bank's revolving door spun, bringing with it a gust of Arctic air and a woman who moved like she owned every space she entered, tall, elegant, with the kind of composure that money bought and maintained. Her coat alone probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months. The woman's heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached the information desk, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I need to see someone immediately about my accounts. I'm sorry, but all our officers are... This can't wait. The woman's tone didn't rise, but something in it made the bank employee straighten. I'm Catherine Whitmore. The name seemed to unlock doors. Suddenly, appointments could be rearranged. Lunch breaks could be interrupted. The impossible became merely inconvenient. Maria watched this exchange from beside a plastic plant, her envelope clutched against her chest. She had witnessed this dance before, the way certain people moved through the world as if it had been designed for their convenience. There was no resentment in her observation, only a quiet recognition of how things worked. Catherine Whitmore turned, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Maria saw something unexpected there. Not the cold calculation she had anticipated, but something that looked almost like panic, carefully contained behind expensive makeup and perfect posture. Mrs. Whitmore, the same teller who had dismissed Maria, now spoke with deference. Mr. Patterson can see you right away. Catherine hesitated, her gaze still fixed on Maria. Something passed between them in that moment. One woman recognizing another's desperation, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of shared humanity in a space that trafficked in numbers and credit scores. Actually, Catherine said, turning back to the teller, this lady was here first. She gestured toward Maria with a slight nod. I can wait a few more minutes. The teller blinked, clearly confused by this deviation from the natural order. Ma'am, you requested urgency, and she's been waiting for hours. Catherine's voice was firm but not unkind. Some things are more important than convenience. Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks. Oh no, please, I can wait. I already have an appointment for next Wednesday. Nonsense. Catherine stepped closer, and Maria caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with something else. Coffee, maybe, or the lingering stress of a difficult morning. Use my appointment. I insist. I couldn't. You could. Catherine smiled, and for the first time since entering the bank, she looked genuinely relaxed. And you should. The teller looked between them like a tennis match he couldn't follow. In the end, efficiency won. Mrs. Gonzalez, Mr. Patterson will see you now. As Maria walked toward the loan officer's door, she felt Catherine's eyes on her back. She wanted to turn around, to say something more than the whispered, "Thank you," she had managed. But the door was already opening, and opportunity had a way of closing as quickly as it appeared. Behind her, Catherine settled into a chair to wait, pulling out her phone with the practiced movements of someone who had learned to make every moment count. She didn't know yet that this simple act of kindness would reshape both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The loan officer's office smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. Mr. Patterson sat behind a desk that seemed designed to create distance, its polished surface reflecting the fluorescent lights like a barrier between hope and reality. Maria perched on the edge of her chair, her envelope open before her, like an offering. "Mrs. Gonzalez, I've reviewed your application." His voice carried the weight of 1,000 rejections delivered with professional courtesy. "Your employment history is inconsistent." Maria's hands folded tighter in her lap. "I work multiple jobs, sir. Cleaning services mostly. The hours vary, but I'm very reliable." "Yes, I see that." He shuffled through her papers, each rustle sounding like another door closing. "But your debt-to-income ratio is concerning. These medical bills, the previous late payments." She wanted to explain about Mrs. Chen's grandson, about Roberto's truck, about the dozen other emergencies that had pulled money from her account like water through a sieve. But explanations felt like excuses, and excuses felt like taking up too much space. "My mother needs her medication," Maria said quietly. "I've never missed a payment once I had the money. I just need a little help getting caught up." Patterson's fingers drummed against the desk. Behind him, certificates hung on the wall, credentials that gave him the power to change lives with a stamp and signature. "I understand the situation is difficult, but the bank has certain requirements." Through the glass partition, Maria could see Catherine Whitmore in the waiting area, her phone pressed to her ear. Even sitting still, she radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having to beg for necessities. Maria wondered what emergencies looked like in a world where money wasn't a constant weight on your chest. "Is there any way, perhaps a smaller amount?" Maria's voice grew softer, as if speaking quietly might make her request seem less burdensome. "Even half of what I asked for would help." Patterson's expression softened slightly, the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news daily. "Mrs. Gonzalez, I wish I could help you. But without collateral or a co-signer, our hands are tied." The word collateral hung in the air between them. What could she offer? The tiny apartment she rented, the 10-year-old car that broke down twice a month, the photographs of her mother that were worth everything to her and nothing to anyone else. "I understand," she said, because understanding was easier than fighting. Fighting required energy she couldn't spare and hope she couldn't afford to lose. As she gathered her papers, Patterson cleared his throat. "There are other options. Community assistance programs, charity organizations." Charity. The word settled in her stomach like cold stone. Maria had spent her life being the one who helped, who gave, who found ways to stretch nothing into something for people who needed it. The idea of standing in another line, in another building, with another envelope full of explanations, felt like swallowing her own dignity. "Thank you for your time," she managed, standing with the careful movements of someone carrying invisible weight. Outside the office, Catherine looked up from her phone. "How did it go?" Maria forced a smile, the same one she wore when her supervisor cut hours, when neighbors forgot to pay her back, when the world reminded her of her place in it. "They'll let me know." But Catherine's eyes were sharp, reading the defeat Maria tried to hide. "I'm sorry." "It's fine. These things happen." Maria tucked her envelope under her arm, preparing for the long walk back to the bus stop. "Thank you again for letting me go first. It was very kind." "Wait." Catherine stood, her heels clicking against the marble as she crossed to where Maria stood. "I'm Catherine Whitmore." "What's your name?" "Maria Gonzalez." "Maria." Catherine repeated it like she was committing it to memory. "That was about medical expenses, wasn't it?" Heat rose in Maria's cheeks. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "For you or someone you care about?" "My mother." The words came out smaller than she intended. "Diabetes." The medications are expensive. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and Maria braced herself for the well-meaning advice she couldn't use, or the pity she couldn't bear. Instead, Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I might know of something, a position that could help with your situation." She handed Maria the card, thick, expensive paper with elegant lettering. "Would you be interested in discussing it?" Maria looked at the card. Catherine Whitmore, followed by a phone number that looked almost too perfect to be real. What kind of position? Household management. It would be steady work, good pay, with benefits that include medical coverage. Catherine's voice was measured, professional. The hours would be regular, and the work environment is quiet. It sounded too good to be true, which in Maria's experience usually meant it was. But standing in this bank, with her mother's medication running low and winter settling deeper into her bones, she couldn't afford the luxury of skepticism. "I'd be very interested," Maria said. "Excellent." Catherine smiled, and something in her expression shifted. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. "Call me tomorrow morning. We can arrange a time to meet properly." As Maria walked toward the revolving door, she felt Catherine watching her. The business card was smooth between her fingers, substantial in a way that made her believe, just for a moment, that perhaps something good could happen to someone like her. Behind her, Catherine finally approached Patterson's office, her emergency suddenly seeming less urgent. She had found what she came looking for, though it hadn't been money at all. The Whitmore estate sat behind wrought iron gates like a fortress of old money and older secrets. Maria stood at the entrance, Catherine's business card damp with nervous sweat in her palm. She had taken 3 buses to reach this neighborhood, where even the sidewalks seemed polished, where every house whispered of lives lived without the constant arithmetic of survival. Catherine answered the door herself, which surprised Maria. She had expected staff, layers of people between the owner and the world. Instead, there was just Catherine in casual clothes that still looked expensive, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested effortless elegance. "Maria, you came." Catherine's smile seemed genuine, but there was something behind her eyes, a watchfulness that made Maria feel like she was being measured. "Please, come in." The foyer stretched upward into shadows that expensive lighting couldn't quite dispel. Everything was beautiful and cold, like walking through a museum where touching was forbidden. Maria's shoes, polished that morning until they gleamed, suddenly felt inadequate against marble floors that reflected her image, back in fractured pieces. "The position involves managing the household," Catherine said, as they walked through rooms that seemed designed for display rather than living. "Coordinating schedules, overseeing maintenance, ensuring everything runs smoothly." They passed a living room where sunlight fell through tall windows onto furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. Catherine, with a man who must be her husband, both of them smiling the kind of smiles that came from knowing the camera was watching. "The salary is competitive," Catherine continued, naming a figure that made Maria's breath catch. It was more than she made from all her cleaning jobs combined, with benefits that included the medical coverage her mother desperately needed. They entered the kitchen, and Maria felt something shift in the atmosphere. Here, finally, was evidence of actual life. Coffee cups in the sink, newspapers folded and refolded, the lingering scent of breakfast. Through the window, she could see the garden where someone with dirt under their fingernails had coaxed beauty from the earth. "You'd have your own quarters," Catherine said, opening a door that led to a small but comfortable suite. "Complete privacy, your own entrance. You could bring your mother if needed. The medical facilities nearby are excellent." Maria walked through the rooms, touching surfaces that felt real in a way the rest of the house didn't. A bed with soft linens, a kitchenette stocked with basics, windows that looked out onto the garden where winter light played through bare branches. "It seems too good to be true," Maria said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Catherine's reflection appeared in the window beside hers. Good things do happen, Maria. Sometimes we just have to be brave enough to accept them. They returned to the kitchen, where Catherine poured coffee into mugs that felt substantial and warm in Maria's hands. The coffee was better than anything she had tasted in years, rich and complex in a way that spoke of beans chosen for flavor rather than price. "I should tell you about the family," Catherine said, settling across from her at a table that bore the comfortable scratches of actual use. "My husband, Thomas, travels frequently for business. My son, David, lives in the carriage house. He's an architect, working on some idealistic project." The way she said idealistic carried affection wrapped in mild exasperation. "And there's Elena, our gardener. She's been with us for 2 years, quiet, hard-working. You'd like her." Through the window, Maria could see a figure moving among the winter bare rose bushes, tending to something invisible but clearly important. Even from a distance, there was precision in the woman's movements, care taken with each action. "The work isn't demanding," Catherine continued. "I'm not often home during the day, and the house mostly takes care of itself. What I need is someone trustworthy, someone who understands discretion." The word discretion hung in the air with weight Maria couldn't quite identify. She thought of her current jobs, office buildings where she moved like a ghost, invisible to the people whose spaces she cleaned, privy to conversations and documents that weren't meant for her eyes. "I understand discretion," Maria said. "I thought you might." Catherine smiled, and for a moment her carefully composed facade slipped to reveal something that looked almost like loneliness. "When could you start?" The question hung between them. Maria thought of her mother, counting pills at the kitchen table, of her supervisor's tight voice explaining reduced hours, of Roberto's broken truck, and Mrs. Chen's grandson, and the dozen other small emergencies that pulled at her from every direction. "Tomorrow," she said. "Wonderful." Catherine reached across the table and briefly touched Maria's hand. Her fingers were soft, manicured, but surprisingly warm. "I think this is going to work out very well for both of us." As Maria prepared to leave, Catherine walked her to the door. "Oh, and Maria, don't worry about references or background checks. Sometimes the best judge of character is intuition." Outside, as the gates closed behind her with an electronic whisper, Maria felt the weight of change settling around her shoulders. She looked back once at the house, where light glowed in windows that no longer seemed quite so cold. In the garden, Eleanor looked up from her work and raised a hand in what might have been greeting or warning. The gesture was too brief, too distant to read clearly. Maria walked toward the bus stop, Catherine's business card still in her pocket, and tried to shake the feeling that she had just agreed to more than household management. But the number Catherine had quoted echoed in her mind, along with promises of medical coverage and her own small space in a world where everything had a place. Behind her, the Whitmore estate settled into evening shadows, keeping its secrets close. Maria arrived at the Whitmore estate the next morning, carrying everything she owned in 2 worn suitcases. The early February air bit at her cheeks as Catherine met her at the side entrance, already dressed in clothes that suggested important places to be. "Perfect timing," Catherine said, leading her through a corridor Maria hadn't seen the day before. "Thomas left for New York this morning, so you'll have time to settle in without interruption." The servants' quarters felt different when filled with Maria's few belongings. Her mother's photograph found a place on the small desk, and the spare uniform she'd kept from her hospital cleaning job hung in the spacious closet like a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. "The daily routine is simple," Catherine explained, handing her a folder thick with schedules and contact lists. "I'm usually gone by 8. David keeps his own hours. The important thing is that the house feels maintained, peaceful." Through the window, Maria caught sight of the gardener kneeling beside the fountain. Eleanor worked with methodical precision, her movements economical in a way that spoke of efficiency born from necessity. She was younger than Maria had expected, perhaps early 30s, with the kind of lean strength that came from physical work. Elena starts early, Catherine noted, following her gaze. She's very dedicated, speaks limited English, keeps to herself mostly. I think you'll find her easy to work with. After Catherine left in a car that probably cost more than Maria would make in 5 years, the house settled into silence that felt heavy with secrets. Maria began her exploration cautiously, learning the rhythm of rooms that echoed with emptiness despite their expensive furnishings. The kitchen became her anchor. Here she could prepare simple meals and feel useful in ways she understood. She was arranging fresh flowers, a small luxury Catherine had mentioned she enjoyed, when the back door opened and Elena stepped inside. Up close, Elena was striking in an understated way. Dark hair pulled back severely, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything, hands that bore small cuts from thorns, and soil stains that spoke of honest work. She moved through the kitchen with familiarity, washing her hands at the sink with practiced efficiency. "Buenos dias," Elena said quietly, her accent carrying the musical cadence of somewhere far from Chicago's harsh edges. "Good morning," Maria replied, then attempted "buenos dias" with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned Spanish from neighbors rather than textbooks. Elena smiled, the first genuine warmth Maria had encountered in this house. "You are Maria?" Catherine told me. Her English was careful but clear, each word chosen with deliberation. "Yes, you're Elena. Elena Vasquez." She dried her hands on a towel that had seen better days. "You live here now?" "For now," Maria said, then immediately wondered why she'd added that qualifier. "I'm managing the household for Mrs. Whitmore." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a flicker of caution that disappeared so quickly, Maria almost missed it. "She is particular about how things should be. Most people are." Maria poured coffee into 2 cups, offering one to Elena. "Have you worked here long?" 2 years. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the mug, as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid. "Good work. Steady. Sometimes that is enough." They sat at the kitchen table, and Maria found herself studying Eleanor's hands. They were strong, capable, with calluses that told stories of labor. But there was something about the way she held the coffee cup, the precise way she spoke, that suggested education buried beneath the role she played. "The gardens must be beautiful in spring," Maria said. "Yes, everything has its season here." Elena's voice carried layers Maria couldn't interpret. "Mrs. Whitmore, she likes things, how do you say, controlled, predictable." Before Maria could ask what she meant, the sound of a car in the driveway interrupted them. Elena was on her feet instantly, moving toward the door with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to avoiding attention. "David," Elena explained, pausing at the threshold. "He is different from his parents. Kind." The back door opened again, and Maria met Catherine's son for the first time. David Whitmore was tall and lean, with the kind of restless energy that seemed at odds with the house's careful stillness. His clothes were expensive but worn with carelessness, a cashmere sweater with a small hole at the elbow, shoes that had walked through more than manicured gardens. "You must be Maria," he said, offering a handshake that was firm and direct. His eyes were kind but tired, carrying the weight of someone fighting battles that weren't immediately visible. "Welcome to the family business." "Family business?" Maria asked. David's smile was rueful. "Keeping up appearances. It's harder work than it looks." Eleanor had melted away during the introduction, returning to her gardens with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned when to be seen and when to disappear. Through the window, Maria watched her tend to roses that wouldn't bloom for months, preparing them for a spring that seemed impossibly distant. "Elena's a mystery," David said, following her gaze. "Brilliant woman. She has degrees in engineering, speaks 4 languages. But she's here, growing my mother's flowers. Why? The question slipped out before Maria could consider whether it was appropriate. David was quiet for a moment, pouring himself coffee with movements that suggested this kitchen was more familiar to him than the formal dining room. Sometimes people need to disappear for a while. Sometimes they need to become invisible until it's safe to be seen again. His words carried weight that made Maria wonder what stories lived beneath the surface of this careful household. She thought of Elena's cautious smile, of Catherine's emphasis on discretion, of her own need to find safety in a world that had grown increasingly uncertain. "What about you?" David asked. "What brings you to our particular corner of invisible?" Maria considered the question, weighing honesty against the habit of keeping personal struggles private. "My mother needs medical care I couldn't afford. Your mother offered a solution." "My mother has a talent for finding people who need solutions," David said, and something in his tone made Maria look up sharply. But his expression was unreadable, and before she could ask what he meant, he was already moving toward the door. "Enjoy the quiet while it lasts," he said over his shoulder. "Things have a way of getting complicated around here." Alone in the kitchen, Maria watched Elena through the window, tending to dormant beauty with patient care. She thought about David's words, about Catherine's emphasis on discretion, about the feeling that she had stepped into a story already in progress. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Chicago's skyline, promising snow that would cover everything in pristine whiteness, making the world look clean and simple when morning came. 3 weeks into her new life, Maria discovered that the Whitmore house kept different hours than the rest of the world. Catherine left each morning at precisely 7:45, returning at unpredictable times with the distracted air of someone juggling invisible pressures. Thomas remained a phantom presence, expensive cologne lingering in hallways, coffee cups left in his study, but never the man himself. It was David who anchored Maria's days with his quiet consistency. He emerged from the carriage house each morning around 9, always carrying architectural drawings rolled under his arm and a coffee thermos that suggested late nights spent working. Their conversations in the kitchen had become a rhythm, brief exchanges about weather and plans that gradually deepened into something approaching friendship. "You're settling in well," he said one morning, watching her arrange fresh tulips in a vase. Her hands moved with the careful precision she brought to all tasks, each stem positioned exactly where it would catch the morning light. "It's peaceful here," Maria replied, though peaceful wasn't quite accurate. The house held a tension she couldn't name, like the moment before thunder when the air grows thick with expectation. "Is it?" David's question carried weight that made her pause. He was studying her with the careful attention of someone reading between lines. "You haven't noticed anything, unusual?" Before she could ask what he meant, Elena appeared at the kitchen door, her face flushed from cold morning air. She paused when she saw David, and Maria caught that flicker of caution again, the way Elena seemed to measure each interaction before committing to it. "Good morning," Elena said, directing the greeting to Maria, while acknowledging David with a nod. She moved to the sink, washing soil from her hands, with movements that had become familiar and somehow comforting to Maria. "Elena, tell Maria about the roses," David said, settling back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone extending a conversation. "She should know what she's getting into." Elena dried her hands slowly, considering. "The roses are demanding. Mrs. Catherine, she wants them perfect. Every bloom, every leaf. No brown spots, no imperfection." She paused. "It is not how roses naturally want to grow." "Nothing here grows naturally," David muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, family dysfunction shouldn't be your problem." "But it is, isn't it?" Elena's voice was quiet but direct. "When you work in someone's house, you work with their problems too." The observation hung in the air with uncomfortable truth. Maria thought about the schedules Catherine had left her, Detailed instructions about when to clean which rooms, which calls to accept, which visitors to admit. There was an orchestration to it that went beyond simple household management. "Elena's right," David said. "My mother has very specific ideas about how things should appear. The house, the gardens, the family." He gestured vaguely at himself. "Everyone has their role to play." "What's your role?" Maria asked. "The dutiful son working to redeem himself through meaningful architecture." His smile was bitter. "I'm designing affordable housing for the West Side, very socially conscious, great for the family image." "That sounds important," Maria said. "It is important. That's the problem." David stood, gathering his drawings with sharp movements that betrayed frustration. "When you do something that actually matters in a family built on appearances, people start asking uncomfortable questions about funding." He was at the door when Elena spoke. "Sometimes the right thing costs more than people want to pay." David turned back, studying Elena with renewed attention. "Exactly. The question is whether you pay it anyway." After he left, Elena and Maria worked in companionable silence. Maria sorted through mail, while Elena arranged tools for her day's work. The routine felt natural, two women finding rhythm in shared space without the need for constant conversation. "He is struggling," Elena said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "David?" "With his family, with his choices." Elena selected a pruning shear, testing its edge with careful precision. "Sometimes good people are born into families that make goodness difficult." "Is that why you're here?" "Because goodness was difficult somewhere else?" Eleanor's hands stilled. For a moment, Maria thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully guarded truth. "I had a life before this. Important work, helping to design infrastructure for communities that needed it. But sometimes, when you help the wrong people, or ask the wrong questions, you discover that the work you thought was helping was actually—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I needed to become someone else for a while, someone invisible. Elena the gardener has no opinions about engineering ethics. She just grows roses and keeps quiet." The revelation settled between them like shared weight. Maria understood the need to become invisible, to find safety in smallness. But the idea that Elena, brilliant, capable Elena, had been forced to hide her true self struck her as fundamentally wrong. "How long do you have to stay invisible?" Maria asked. "Until it is safe to be seen again, until the people who made it dangerous forget I exist." Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Gardens are patient work. Things grow in their own time." That afternoon, while Elena worked outside and David disappeared into his architectural plans, Maria found herself in Catherine's study organizing papers. The room felt like Catherine herself, beautiful, carefully arranged, but somehow cold, despite the expensive furnishings. Among the documents were architectural drawings she recognized as David's work, housing plans for a development that looked nothing like the mansions in this neighborhood. Simple, functional homes designed for families who counted every dollar. The plans were covered with David's careful notations, adjustments that spoke of someone trying to squeeze dignity from impossibly tight budgets. But there were other papers mixed in, financial documents with numbers that made Maria's head spin, development costs that seemed too high, funding sources that looked questionable. And at the bottom of one page, a note in Catherine's precise handwriting: "David cannot know about the additional backing." Maria stared at the papers, feeling the weight of accidental knowledge. She had stumbled into someone else's secret, and the feeling made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. In her experience, knowing things she wasn't supposed to know led to complications she couldn't afford. But as she carefully reorganized the documents, she couldn't shake Elena's words about the right thing costing more than people wanted to pay, or David's bitter observation about family dysfunction becoming everyone's problem. Outside, the February sun cast long shadows across Elena's carefully tended garden, where invisible roots were already beginning the slow work of spring. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while Maria was arranging Catherine's schedule. Her mother's voice, thin and worried, cut through the expensive silence of the Whitmore study. "Misha, the insurance approved the new medication. Can you believe it? After all these months of fighting, they finally said yes." Her mother's relief was palpable through the phone. "The coverage from your new job, it's like a miracle." Maria felt warmth spread through her chest, the first unqualified good news she'd received in years. "That's wonderful, Mama. How are you feeling?" "Better, much better. The doctor says if I stay consistent with this treatment, I could have years more of good health." Her mother paused. "You found something special there, didn't you? Working for good people who take care of their employees." After the call ended, Maria sat surrounded by Catherine's carefully organized documents, wrestling with the contradiction between her mother's gratitude and the growing unease that had been building since she'd glimpsed those financial papers. Good people. The phrase echoed in her mind with uncomfortable weight. That afternoon, Catherine returned home earlier than usual, moving through the house with an energy that seemed barely controlled. She found Maria in the kitchen, where Eleanor was washing vegetables for dinner with her usual methodical precision. "Perfect, you're both here." Catherine's smile was bright but brittle. "Maria, I need you to make some calls for me. There's a list on my desk of contractors and suppliers. They'll need new contact information for the housing project David's working on." "Of course," Maria said, though something in Catherine's tone made her hesitate. "And Elena, the city inspector, will be coming by tomorrow to look at the garden permits. Make sure everything looks established." Eleanor's hands stilled in the running water. "Established? Natural. Like the landscaping has been here for years." Catherine's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having details handled without question. "You understand." After Catherine left, Eleanor turned off the water and dried her hands with sharp, efficient movements. The vegetables lay forgotten in the sink. "Garden permits don't require inspections," Elena said quietly. "And landscaping that looks established when it isn't, that's not about gardens." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. "What do you think she meant?" "I think we're being asked to help with something that isn't what it appears to be." Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but Maria caught the tension beneath. "In my previous life, I learned that when people ask you to make things look natural when they're not, it's usually because someone is going to be deceived." That evening, while David worked late in the carriage house and Catherine attended some social function, Maria found herself alone with the list of phone calls she was supposed to make. The numbers belonged to legitimate businesses, contractors, suppliers, architects. But the contact information she was supposed to give them wasn't for David's office or the housing project site. It was for a series of shell companies with addresses that led to empty offices downtown. Maria stared at the papers, her mother's voice echoing in her memory, "Working for good people who take care of their employees." The medical insurance that was saving her mother's life suddenly felt heavy in her hands, weighted with obligations she was only beginning to understand. She made the calls. Each conversation was brief, professional. The contractors seemed unsurprised by the contact changes, as if this kind of administrative shuffle happened regularly. No one asked questions that would require her to explain what she didn't understand herself. But with each call she felt something inside her shift. The part of her that had always said yes, always helped, always found ways to make things work for people who needed it. That part was being used for something she couldn't name but instinctively feared. Later that night, she found David in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Rough day?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Every day." He looked up, and she saw exhaustion etched in lines too deep for someone his age. Do you ever feel like you're fighting a war but you're not sure who the enemy is? Sometimes. Maria chose her words carefully. Your mother asked me to make some calls today about your housing project. David's attention sharpened. What kind of calls? Contact information updates for contractors and suppliers. She watched his face as she spoke, seeing wariness replace exhaustion. The numbers seemed unusual. Unusual how? They weren't connected to your project directly. Shell companies, I think. David was quiet for so long that Maria began to regret speaking. When he finally responded, his voice was barely above a whisper. She's funding it. The extra money I need to make the housing actually affordable instead of just cheap. It's coming from her. But she doesn't want me to know where it originates. Is that a problem? It is if the money isn't clean. David ran his hands through his hair, leaving it disheveled in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable. My mother has always been able to find resources when she needs them. I've learned not to ask too many questions about her methods, but now you're wondering if you should. Now I'm wondering if my idealistic housing project is being built with money that came from exactly the kind of exploitation I'm trying to fight against. He laughed bitterly. Wouldn't that be perfect, helping poor families with money stolen from poor families? The weight of complicity settled around them like fog. Maria thought about Elena's careful words about the right thing costing more than people wanted to pay. About her own phone calls that afternoon, each one pulling her deeper into a web she couldn't see clearly. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know. If I refuse the funding, the project dies. 50 families don't get decent homes. If I accept it, he trailed off, staring into his cold coffee as if it might hold answers. What would you do? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Outside, the February wind rattled windows and reminded them both that winter still held the city in its grip, that spring was a promise that might or might not be kept. I don't know either, Maria admitted, and realized that for the first time in her life, not knowing felt like the most honest answer she could give. The city inspector never came. Elena spent the morning making the garden look established, but by afternoon, Catherine called to cancel the appointment with the same casual dismissal she used for routine changes. Elena said nothing, but Maria caught the way her hands gripped the pruning shears a little too tightly. It was that weekend when Maria met Thomas Whitmore for the first time. He arrived home unexpectedly on Saturday evening, filling the house's careful silence with the kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. Tall, silver-haired, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to justify his existence to anyone. His handshake was firm, his smile polite, but his eyes held the calculating coldness of someone perpetually measuring value. So you're the Maria I've heard so much about, he said over dinner, the first meal Maria had shared with the family rather than prepared and retreated from. Catherine tells me you've been invaluable. I try to help where I can, Maria replied, the familiar reflex of making herself small in the presence of authority. Help? Thomas repeated the word like he was testing its weight. Such an interesting concept. Most people think help means giving people what they want, but real help, meaningful help, sometimes means giving people what they need whether they want it or not. Catherine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. David looked up from his plate with the wary attention of someone recognizing dangerous territory. Take my son's housing project, Thomas continued, cutting his steak with precise movements. David thinks he's helping these families by giving them affordable homes, but what he's really doing is enabling dependency, teaching people that someone else will solve their problems for them. That's not, David began. Let me finish. Thomas's voice didn't rise, but something in it made David fall silent. Real help would be creating opportunities for these families to earn better housing, jobs, education, upward mobility, not charity disguised as social justice. The families need homes now, David said quietly, while they're working toward those opportunities you're talking about. Do they? Or do they need to understand that comfort isn't a right, it's something you earn? Thomas took a sip of wine, his movements unhurried. Maria understands this. Don't you, Maria? You've worked for everything you have. No one handed you anything. Maria felt every eye at the table turn toward her. The weight of expectation, of being used as an example in an argument she didn't want to be part of, settled on her shoulders like lead. I've been fortunate to find work, she said carefully. Fortunate. Thomas smiled. See? She understands that success comes from recognizing opportunities and being willing to do what's necessary to seize them, not from waiting for someone else to solve your problems. What if the opportunities aren't equally available to everyone? Elena's voice came from the doorway, where she stood with coffee service. Maria hadn't even heard her enter. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas turned to look at Elena with interest rather than irritation, as if she had just become visible to him for the first time. Elena, isn't it? Our gardener. His tone was conversational, but Maria caught the subtle emphasis on our and gardener. You have an opinion on economic philosophy. I have experience with systems that promise equal opportunity while ensuring it doesn't exist. Elena moved into the room with careful grace, setting down the coffee service without making a sound. Sometimes the game is designed so that working hard isn't enough. Sometimes the rules change depending on who's playing. Interesting perspective from someone who chose to leave her home country for better opportunities here. Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment. Yes, I made that choice. But not everyone gets to choose their circumstances. Sometimes circumstances choose them. The conversation felt like a chess game being played on multiple levels. Maria watched the exchanges with growing unease, sensing undercurrents she couldn't fully grasp, but instinctively feared. Well, Thomas said finally, raising his wine glass, here's to making the best of whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, and to the people who help us do it. He looked directly at Maria as he spoke, and something in his expression made her skin crawl. She raised her water glass in response, but the gesture felt like signing a contract she hadn't read. Later that evening, after Thomas had retired to his study and Catherine had disappeared into her own private world, Maria found herself in the kitchen with David and Elena. The three of them cleaned up from dinner in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. He knows, Elena said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Knows what? David asked, but his tone suggested he already understood. About me, about who I really am. Elena dried a plate with sharp, efficient movements. The comment about leaving my home country, he wasn't guessing. How could he know? Maria asked, the same way he knows everything else that might be useful to him. David's voice was bitter. My father doesn't believe in coincidences. If Elena's here, if you're here, Maria, it's because he wanted you here. The revelation hit Maria like cold water. She thought about the bank, about Catherine's timely appearance, about the job offer that had seemed too good to be true. Because it was too good to be true. Why, she asked, though part of her already feared the answer. Because we all have something he can use, Eleanor said. My engineering background, my legal situation, your financial desperation, your mother's medical needs, David's idealism and his guilt about family money. Use for what? David and Elena exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding, born from bitter experience. For whatever he needs us to do, David said. And if we refuse, we lose everything. Your mother's medical coverage, Elena's legal protection, my funding for the housing project. He's made us all dependent on him, Elena added, and dependency makes people controllable. Maria sank into a chair, the full weight of her situation finally clear. The medical insurance that was keeping her mother alive wasn't generosity, it was leverage. The job that had saved her from poverty wasn't opportunity, it was entrapment. What do we do? She asked. We survive, Eleanor said simply. Until we figure out how to do more than survive. Outside, the February night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and Maria wondered if spring would ever come to this carefully controlled house where nothing grew naturally, where even kindness came with hidden costs. In his study, Thomas Whitmore worked late into the night, making phone calls and moving pieces on boards that only he could see clearly. And somewhere in those calculations were 3 women who had trusted that sometimes good things happened to people like them. The revelation came the following Tuesday, hidden in the mundane task of organizing Catherine's correspondence. Maria was filing documents when she found the letter tucked between insurance forms and bank statements, a legal document with Elena's real name in bold type at the top. Elena Vasquez, formerly Senior Infrastructure Engineer for the Municipal Development Authority of San Jose, Costa Rica, currently under federal investigation for her role in exposing corruption in a water treatment project funded by American investors. Subject to deportation proceedings pending resolution of criminal charges. Maria stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. The careful gardener, who had become her quiet friend, was actually a whistleblower hiding in plain sight. And Thomas Whitmore had documentation of her legal status, her vulnerability, her desperate need to remain invisible. Find something interesting? Maria spun around to find Catherine standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. The letter felt like evidence of a crime in Maria's hands, though she couldn't say which crime or who was guilty of it. I was just organizing your files, Maria said, her voice smaller than she intended. Of course you were. Catherine entered the study and closed the door behind her, the soft click sounding final. You're very thorough, Maria. I appreciate that in an employee. Catherine settled into the chair across from the desk, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. Everything about her posture suggested a conversation that had been planned, anticipated, prepared for. Elena's story is tragic, isn't it? Catherine's voice carried what sounded like genuine sympathy. Brilliant woman, trying to do the right thing, discovering that the right thing can be very dangerous when it threatens the wrong people. I don't understand, Maria said, though she was beginning to understand too well. She exposed a network of contractors who were cutting corners on water treatment systems, skimping on materials, falsifying safety reports, pocketing the difference. People got sick. Children got sick. Catherine's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were recounting someone else's news rather than Elena's life. She had evidence, documented everything, brought it to the authorities. That sounds like the right thing to do. Oh, it absolutely was. The problem is that some of those contractors had connections to very powerful people. People who don't like their business arrangements, questioned by inconvenient engineers with inconvenient consciences. Maria felt sick. So she had to run. She had to disappear. And disappearing is expensive, Maria. Especially when you need legal protection, new documentation, and time for very dangerous people to forget you exist. Catherine leaned forward, her voice softening with what might have been genuine compassion. When someone like Elena needs to become invisible, she doesn't have many options. She can't exactly apply for normal jobs with her real credentials. So you helped her. We provided a solution that benefited everyone. Elena gets legal protection and legitimate work. We get someone with extraordinary skills who understands the value of discretion. Catherine paused. It's not charity, Maria. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. The words hung in the air between them, and Maria began to understand the real architecture of the Whitmore household. Not employer and employees, but a carefully constructed web of dependencies disguised as generosity. What about David's housing project? Maria asked. What about it? Is that part of the arrangement too? Catherine smiled, and for the first time since Maria had known her, the expression looked genuinely pleased rather than carefully managed. You're very perceptive. Yes, David's project serves several purposes. It provides good publicity for the family, keeps David occupied with meaningful work, and creates useful connections with city officials who appreciate our commitment to social responsibility. And the funding. The funding comes from various sources, some of them more complicated than others. Catherine's tone suggested this was as much detail as she intended to provide. The important thing is that good work gets done. Families get homes they can afford. Everyone benefits. Maria thought about the shell companies, the phone calls she'd made, the careful orchestration that kept David unaware of the true source of his idealistic funding. Even if David doesn't know where the money comes from, especially then, David's conscience is very important to him. If he knew that some of the funding came from sources he might find morally questionable, he'd refuse it. And then no families would get homes at all. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced movements. Sometimes protecting people from uncomfortable truths is the kindest thing you can do. What about me? The question slipped out before Maria could stop it. What arrangement am I part of? Catherine paused at the door, her hand on the knob. You're part of the most important arrangement of all, Maria. You're the person who keeps everything running smoothly, who sees what needs to be seen and overlooks what needs to be overlooked, who understands that sometimes the world is more complicated than we'd like it to be. And if I don't want to be part of it, then your mother goes back to rationing insulin. Elena gets deported to face charges that could put her in prison for 20 years. David's housing project dies and 50 families remain homeless. Catherine's voice was gentle, almost sad. But of course that's entirely your choice. After Catherine left, Maria sat alone in the study, Elena's legal documents still in her hands. Through the window, she could see Elena working in the garden, patient and methodical as always, tending to growth that would emerge in its own time. She thought about choice, how it could be an illusion presented as freedom, how helping people could become a weapon used against them, how the line between salvation and manipulation could be thin as paper. That evening, she found Elena in the greenhouse, repotting seedlings that wouldn't see soil for another month. The work was precise, almost meditative, each small plant receiving exactly the care it needed. I know about your real situation, Maria said quietly. Eleanor's hand stilled for a moment, then continued their work. I wondered when that would happen. Are you really in danger if you leave? Yes. Eleanor's voice was calm, matter of fact. The people I exposed have long memories and longer reach. Staying invisible keeps me alive. But you're not really invisible here, are you? The Whitmores know exactly who you are. Elena looked up from her work, her expression thoughtful. No, but they benefit from my invisibility as much as I do. It makes us compatible, even if that compatibility costs other people. Everything costs other people, Maria. The question is whether the cost is worth what it buys. Elena returned to her seedlings, her voice quiet but steady. I chose to stay alive and useful rather than dead and pure. Maria watched Elena work and wondered if she would make the same choice, if survival and complicity were really the only options, if there was a third path she simply couldn't see yet. The seedlings grew in their controlled environment, safe from weather that might kill them, dependent on careful hands to give them everything they needed to survive. The decision came to Maria at 3 in the morning on a sleepless Wednesday, when the weight of accumulated compromises finally exceeded her capacity to carry them. Not everyone would make that choice, but it was the right choice for me. Outside, March wind rattled the greenhouse windows, carrying the promise of spring and the threat of storms yet to come. She had been lying in her comfortable bed, listening to the expensive silence of the Whitmore house, thinking about her mother's voice on the phone earlier that evening. The doctor says my blood sugar is the best it's been in years, Mika. This insurance, this treatment, it's given me my life back. Her mother had paused, then added with the wisdom of someone who had lived through poverty, I know good things don't come without cost. I just pray the cost isn't yours to pay." Maria rose and dressed quietly, moving through the house like the ghost she had trained herself to be in other people's spaces. But instead of making herself invisible, she gathered the documents she had been organizing, filing and pretending not to understand. Financial records, correspondence, legal papers, evidence of the careful web Thomas and Catherine had woven around their charitable endeavors. By dawn, she had copied everything onto a flash drive, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with the information, but she knew she couldn't continue pretending ignorance while other people paid the price for her family's comfort. Elena found her in the kitchen as the morning light filtered through windows that looked out onto a garden where nothing was quite what it appeared to be. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," Elena observed, pouring coffee with the careful attention she brought to all tasks. "I've been thinking about costs," Maria said. "About what we're willing to pay and what we're willing to let other people pay for us." Elena studied her over the rim of her coffee cup. Dangerous thoughts in a house like this. Maybe necessary thoughts. They sat in silence for a moment. Two women who had learned to communicate as much through what they didn't say as what they did. Outside, David emerged from the carriage house, architectural drawings under his arm, walking with the determined stride of someone carrying purpose. "He doesn't know, does he?" Maria asked. "About where the money really comes from. Some truths are too expensive for people like David to afford." Elena's voice carried the weariness of someone who had calculated moral costs too many times. His guilt over family wealth is already eating him alive. Learning that his idealistic project is funded by the same kind of exploitation he's trying to fight against would destroy him, or it might free him. Elena turned to study Maria with new attention. Free him to do what? Refuse the funding and watch 50 families remain homeless? Abandon the only meaningful work he's ever done? Sometimes ignorance is a mercy, and sometimes it's a prison. David entered the kitchen as these words hung in the air, bringing with him the energy of someone who had been working since before dawn. His eyes were bright with excitement, his movements quick with the urgency of someone who had found solutions to impossible problems. "The first families move in next month," he announced, spreading his drawings across the kitchen table. "Mrs. Rodriguez and her 3 kids, the Johnsons with their new baby, old Mr. Garcia, who's been living in his car since his landlord doubled the rent." Maria looked at the plans. Simple homes designed with care and attention to the dignity of their future residents. Every detail spoke of David's commitment to creating not just shelter, but genuine homes for people who had been forgotten by a system that priced them out of basic human needs. "It's beautiful work," she said, meaning it. "It's necessary work." David's voice carried the conviction of someone who had found his purpose. "These families deserve better than the slumlords and profiteers who've been exploiting them. They deserve homes they can afford, neighborhoods they can be proud of, a chance to build something stable for their children." "Where will the next phase be funded from?" Elena asked quietly. "We're negotiating with several sources. Mother has connections with investors who are interested in socially responsible development." David's enthusiasm faltered slightly, the first hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "The profit margins are thin, but that's the point. Housing should be a human right, not a commodity." Maria watched his face as he spoke, seeing the passionate idealism that made him both admirable and vulnerable. He genuinely believed in the work he was doing, genuinely cared about the families who would benefit from it. The fact that his noble intentions were being used as cover for less noble purposes wasn't his fault, but it was his responsibility once he knew about it. "David," she said carefully, "what would you do if you discovered that some of the funding came from sources you wouldn't approve of?" His hands stilled on the architectural drawings. "What kind of sources?" "Hypothetically, If you learned that good work was being accomplished with money that had been obtained through exploitation or corruption, what would be the right thing to do? David was quiet for a long moment, his finger tracing the outline of one of his carefully designed homes. When he looked up, his expression was troubled but thoughtful. I'd want to know the truth, even if it was painful, especially if it was painful. He paused. But I'd also want to find a way to protect the families who are depending on this project. They shouldn't have to pay the price for adult complications they had nothing to do with, even if protecting them meant continuing to participate in something you considered wrong. I don't know. His honesty was stark, uncomfortable. I'd like to think I'd find a third option, some way to do the right thing without sacrificing innocent people. But maybe that's naive. Maybe it's hope, Elena said softly. After David left for a meeting with city planners, Maria and Elena remained in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of idealistic dreams and complicated realities. He deserves to know, Maria said. Knowing will destroy him. Not knowing is destroying him differently, and it's destroying other people too. Maria pulled the flash drive from her pocket, the small device feeling heavier than it had any right to. I copied the financial records, everything Catherine has been hiding from him. Elena stared at the drive, understanding immediately what Maria was proposing. If you give that to him, everything changes. For all of us. Everything is already changing. Maria thought of her sleepless night, of her mother's gratitude, of the families who would move into David's homes next month without knowing the true cost of their salvation. The question is whether we're going to be part of that change or victims of it. Catherine and Thomas won't forgive betrayal. They'll take away everything. Your mother's medical coverage, David's funding, my legal protection. I know. Maria's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. But maybe there's something worth more than their protection. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the window where her carefully tended garden waited for spring. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade. If you're going to do this, you'll need help. Someone who understands how their financial systems work. Who knows which documents will make the biggest impact? She paused. Someone who has experience exposing corruption, even when it's dangerous. Maria looked at her friend, brilliant, careful Elena, who had already paid a high price for choosing truth over safety, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar weight of compromise, but the lighter, more dangerous feeling of possibility. Are you saying you'll help? I'm saying that some things are worth the risk. And maybe it's time to stop letting other people pay the price for our survival. Outside, the March wind carried the scent of change, and in the kitchen of the Whitmore house, two women began to plan a revolution disguised as housework. The confrontation came sooner than Maria had expected. She was in Catherine's study, ostensibly organizing correspondence, but actually copying the last of the financial documents, when Catherine appeared in the doorway, with the silent precision of someone who had been watching and waiting. Find everything you're looking for. Catherine's voice was conversational, almost friendly, but something in her posture suggested a conversation that had moved past pretense. Maria's hand froze over the filing cabinet. The flash drive felt like it was burning in her pocket, though she had taken care to hide any evidence of what she was doing. Just organizing your files, as requested, Maria said, her voice steadier than she felt. Of course. Catherine entered the room and closed the door behind her. You're very thorough, Maria. Perhaps too thorough for your own good. The words hung between them like a challenge. Maria turned to face Catherine fully, abandoning any pretense of casual filing. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you know exactly what I mean. Catherine moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where Elena was pruning roses with her usual methodical care. Elena told me about your conversation yesterday, about costs and prices and moral calculations. Maria felt her heart stutter. Elena had warned Catherine, but even as the thought formed, she rejected it. Elena wouldn't betray her, not after everything they had shared, everything they had understood about each other. She was concerned about you, Catherine continued as if reading her thoughts. She knows what happens to people who make certain kinds of choices in houses like this one. What kinds of choices? Catherine turned from the window, and for the first time since Maria had known her, her carefully composed facade showed cracks. She looked tired, older, like someone carrying weight she couldn't set down. The choice to bite the hand that feeds you, the choice to destroy something good because it isn't perfect. Catherine's voice carried genuine sadness. Elena has been where you are, Maria. She knows how it feels to have principles that are more expensive than you can afford. She also knows what it feels like to live with the consequences of staying silent. Does she? Or does she know what it feels like to sacrifice everything for principles that no one else can afford either? Catherine sat down heavily in her desk chair. Elena exposed corruption in Costa Rica. Good for her, noble, righteous. And what did it accomplish? The contractors she exposed were replaced by other contractors who are just as corrupt but more careful. The children who were getting sick from contaminated water are still getting sick. But now Elena lives in exile, and the people who tried to help her are in prison. The words hit Maria like physical blows. She thought of Elena in the garden, carefully tending plants that would bloom in their own time, accepting the constraints of controlled growth rather than the chaos of natural exposure. That doesn't mean she was wrong to try, doesn't it? Sometimes the only choice is between imperfect solutions and perfect disasters. Catherine opened a desk drawer and pulled out a folder thick with documents. Do you want to know what happens if David's housing project loses funding? Do you want to see the impact assessments, the social worker reports, the statistics about what happens to families when affordable housing disappears? She spread the papers across the desk. Clinical analyses of human suffering, charts that reduced desperation to data points. Maria saw photographs of families living in cars, children sleeping in emergency shelters, elderly people choosing between medication and rent. 50 families, Maria. That's what your principles will cost. 50 families who will end up homeless because you decided that the source of their salvation wasn't pure enough for your comfort. And how many families are suffering so that these 50 can be saved? Maria's voice was stronger now, fueled by anger at the manipulation disguised as moral complexity. How many people are being exploited to fund David's idealism? Fewer than will suffer if the project fails. Catherine's response was immediate, practiced. The funding comes from development projects that were going to happen anyway. At least this way, some of the profit goes toward helping people instead of just enriching investors. Development projects that displace other poor families, that gentrify neighborhoods and price out the people who've lived there for generations. Maria had done her research, had traced the shell companies back to their sources. You're robbing one community to help another, then pretending it's charity. Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying Maria with something that might have been respect. You have been thorough, she said finally. Yes, the funding mechanism is complicated. Yes, some communities are impacted by the development that generates resources for David's project. But the alternative isn't no development. It's development that helps no one except the already wealthy. The alternative is finding funding that doesn't require exploitation. Show me where that funding exists. Show me the foundation, the government program, the private investor who will fund affordable housing without expecting returns that make it unaffordable. Catherine's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed demeanor. I've been looking for clean money for David's projects for 3 years. It doesn't exist, not at the scale needed to make a real difference. The argument felt like quicksand. The more Maria struggled against it, the deeper she sank into moral ambiguity. But she thought of Elena's words about the right thing costing more than people wanted to pay, and held on to the certainty that some costs were too high, regardless of the benefits they purchased. What about Elena's situation? What about the legal protection you're providing her? Is that funded by exploitation too? Elena's protection comes from connections, favors owed, and careful documentation that keeps dangerous people from finding her. It costs money, yes, but not the kind you're worried about. Catherine paused. Though if this household falls apart because of your principles, Elena loses that protection, and David loses his funding, and your mother loses her medical coverage. There it was. The threat wrapped in consequence, the careful architecture of dependency wielded like a weapon. You're saying I have to choose between my conscience and everyone I care about. I'm saying that's the choice the world has given us. I didn't create these constraints, Maria. I just learned to work within them. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt with movements that suggested a conversation drawing to its close. Elena understands this. David, for all his idealism, understands this. The question is whether you're mature enough to understand it too. Mature enough to compromise with evil, you mean? Mature enough to choose the lesser evil when perfect good isn't an option. Catherine moved toward the door, then paused. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Either you're part of the solution we've built here, or you're not. But if you're not, you accept responsibility for what happens to everyone who depends on the stability you're choosing to destroy. After Catherine left, Maria sat alone in the study, surrounded by evidence of moral complexity that felt designed to paralyze rather than enlighten. Through the window, she watched Elena working in the garden, patient and careful as always. But as she watched, Maria realized something had changed in Elena's movements. There was precision there, yes, but also preparation. Elena was gathering things, tools, containers, small plants, getting ready for something that looked less like seasonal garden maintenance and more like departure. Maria pulled out her phone and typed a simple message. Meeting tonight? Elena's response came quickly. Greenhouse. After midnight. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Chicago, promising the kind of spring weather that could be gentle or violent depending on which way the wind blew. The greenhouse at midnight felt like a sanctuary suspended between worlds. Elena was there when Maria arrived, sitting among seedlings that wouldn't see soil for another month, her hands busy with the careful work of transplanting. But these weren't the ornamental flowers Catherine preferred. These were vegetables, practical plants that would feed people rather than impress them. You're leaving, Maria said quietly, settling onto an overturned pot beside Elena's workstation. We're leaving. Elena didn't look up from her transplanting, but her voice carried certainty. Both of us, tonight. Elena, I can't just... Your mother. Elena set down her small spade and turned to face Maria directly. I've been working on that. There are community health centers, sliding-scale programs, patient advocacy groups. Your mother doesn't have to choose between her medication and your conscience. Maria felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. You researched alternatives to the insurance? I researched everything. Community resources, legal aid organizations, housing assistance programs. The safety net exists, Maria. It's fragmented and underfunded and requires patience, but it exists. Elena's voice carried the authority of someone who had navigated bureaucratic labyrinths before. Your mother will have to fight a little harder for her care, but she'll have it, and she'll have it without the strings attached to Whitmore money. What about you? Your legal protection? Elena was quiet for a moment, her hands returning to the delicate work of ensuring small roots had room to grow. I contacted my original attorney in Costa Rica. The case has moved forward without me. Several of the contractors I exposed have been convicted, and the corruption network has been largely dismantled. It's safe for me to surface again. Safe to go home? Safe to exist openly. Home is still complicated. There are people there who won't forgive me for the disruption I caused, even if I was right. But I can work legally now, use my real name, practice engineering again. She paused. I can stop hiding. Maria watched Elena work, seeing in her careful movements the patience of someone who had learned to tend hope in the darkest circumstances. What about David? His project? David is the hardest part. Elena's voice carried genuine sadness. But he deserves to know the truth about his funding, even if it destroys everything he thinks he's building. Especially then. Catherine was right about one thing: 50 families will suffer if the project fails. Yes, but how many families suffered to create the funding for those 50? And how many more will suffer if this model of corruption disguised as charity continues? Elena looked up, her expression serious. Sometimes you have to break a cycle, even when breaking it causes immediate pain. Maria thought about her conversation with Catherine, about the careful architecture of dependency that made resistance feel like cruelty. She made it sound like there were no clean alternatives. There are always alternatives. They're just harder and slower and less convenient. Elena gestured toward the vegetables growing around them. This garden could feed people. Real nutrition, not ornamental beauty. But Catherine prefers flowers because they look better from the house. It's a choice, not a necessity. So what's our alternative? Elena reached into her work bag and pulled out a folder thick with documents. We expose everything, but we do it strategically, with support systems in place for the people who will be impacted. I've been in contact with investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, housing advocacy groups. They're ready to coordinate a response that helps David's families find other resources while dismantling the Whitmore network. Maria felt fear and hope war in her chest. The Whitmores won't just accept exposure, they'll fight back. Of course they will, but they'll be fighting a prepared opposition instead of isolated individuals. Elena's voice carried the confidence of someone who had learned from previous battles. And they'll be fighting without their most valuable weapon, which is our dependency, our fear of losing what they've given us. Once we break free from that fear, once we prove we can survive without their version of help, their power over us disappears. Through the greenhouse windows, Maria could see the main house, its windows glowing with expensive warmth. Inside, Catherine and Thomas slept in beds purchased with carefully laundered money, surrounded by beautiful objects that hid ugly truths. Tomorrow, they would wake expecting continued compliance from the people they had helped and trapped in equal measure. When do we do it? Maria asked. Dawn. While they're both asleep. We copy the last of the financial records, gather the evidence we need, and leave together. Elena's hands stilled in their work. Are you ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back to the safe option. Maria thought about her mother, counting pills at a kitchen table in a neighborhood where medical care was a luxury and insurance was hope. She thought about Eleanor, hiding her brilliance in garden soil for 2 years. She thought about David, building homes for desperate families, while unknowingly perpetuating the systems that created their desperation. And she thought about the woman she had been 3 months ago, someone who said yes to everything, who made herself small in other people's spaces, who believed that accepting whatever was offered was the same thing as being grateful. I'm ready, she said. Elena smiled. And for the first time since Maria had known her, the expression reached her. Eyes completely. Good, because I've missed being myself. I've missed fighting for things that matter. They worked together for the next hour, Elena sharing what she knew about documenting financial crimes, while Maria organized the evidence they had already gathered. It felt like planning a revolution in miniature, 2 women preparing to reclaim their agency from people who had disguised control as care. Outside, the March wind picked up, rattling greenhouse windows and promising change. Storm clouds moved across the Chicago skyline, But between them, stars appeared, distant lights that had traveled impossible distances to reach this moment, this place, these two women planning to risk everything for the chance to live without compromise. At 3 in the morning, Elena walked Maria back to her quarters, where she would try to sleep for a few hours before the most important morning of her life. "Elena," Maria said at her door, "what if we're wrong? What if Catherine is right and we're just destroying something imperfect but good?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Then we'll build something better from the pieces, but at least it will be something we can live with. Even if it's harder, especially if it's harder. Easy things that require other people's suffering aren't really easy at all. They just push the difficulty onto someone else." Elena squeezed Maria's hand. "Tomorrow we stop pushing our problems onto other people." As Maria lay in bed, listening to the wind and the settling sounds of the expensive house around her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the weight of a decision she could live with, regardless of its consequences. Outside, Elena returned to the greenhouse to finish her preparations, working by the light of stars that had refused to be hidden by clouds. Dawn came quietly to the Whitmore estate, the kind of gentle spring morning that promised rebirth without guaranteeing ease. "Sleep well." Maria and Elena moved through the house like ghosts with purpose, gathering the last pieces of evidence they needed while the family slept behind closed doors. The financial records told a story that was both simpler and more complex than Maria had imagined. Thomas Whitmore hadn't stolen money. He had created systems that allowed exploitation to flourish while maintaining plausible deniability. Development projects that displaced low-income communities, tax shelters that diverted public funds from social services, investment schemes that extracted wealth from vulnerable neighborhoods. All legal, all carefully documented, all devastating to the people who could least afford the cost. "He's brilliant at this," Eleanor whispered as they copied the last files onto encrypted drives. "The corruption is so layered, so systematic, that no single action looks criminal. But the pattern is unmistakable." They were finishing when footsteps in the hallway froze them both. Maria's heart hammered as she quickly closed file cabinets, but the steps passed by. David, heading to the kitchen for his morning coffee as always. "We should tell him," Eleanor said quietly, "before we leave. He deserves to hear it from us." They found David in the kitchen, surrounded by architectural drawings that had become his life's work. He looked up as they entered, and something in their expressions made his coffee cup pause halfway to his lips. "You're both awake early," he said, but his voice carried wariness rather than surprise. Maria and Elena exchanged a look. They had planned this conversation, but facing David's trusting expression made the words feel heavier than they had anticipated. "David," Maria began, "we need to tell you something about your housing project. About where the funding really comes from." His face went very still. "I thought it might be something like this. The way Mother avoided specifics, the shell companies, the careful distance between my work and the financial mechanisms." He set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "How bad is it?" Elena spread some of the financial documents across the kitchen table, pointing to connections that drew clear lines between David's idealistic housing and his father's exploitation of other communities. "Bad," she said simply. "The money funding your project comes from development deals that have displaced hundreds of families. Your 50 units of affordable housing exist because other neighborhoods were gentrified out of existence." David studied the papers, his face cycling through emotions, shock, anger, devastation, and finally a kind of terrible clarity. "So I'm not helping anyone. I'm just moving the problem around, making myself feel better while the system continues." "You didn't know," Maria said gently. "I should have known. I wanted clean money so badly that I didn't look closely enough at what I was accepting." He laughed bitterly. My father was right about one thing. Idealism without practical knowledge is just self-indulgence. What will you do? Elena asked. David was quiet for a long time, studying the drawings that had represented hope and purpose to him for months. When he looked up, his expression had hardened into something Maria hadn't seen before, resolve tempered by painful understanding. I'm going to finish the housing project, he said, but I'm going to do it differently. No more shell companies, no more hidden funding. I'll find investors who are willing to accept smaller profits for clean development. It'll take longer, help fewer families in the short term, but at least it won't perpetuate the systems that create homelessness in the first place. That's going to be incredibly difficult, Elena said. Good. Difficult means I'll have to actually solve the problem instead of just treating symptoms. David began rolling up his architectural drawings with movements that suggested new purpose rather than defeat. And I'm going to make sure the families who are counting on these homes have other options, real options, not just different versions of exploitation. We're exposing everything, Maria said. This morning. We have journalists and prosecutors ready to coordinate their response. David nodded. I figured as much. How much time do I have? A few hours, maybe. Enough to contact the families, start connecting them with housing advocates and community organizations, and enough to liquidate my trust fund, David added, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. If I'm going to build something clean, I need clean money, money I earned, money that doesn't come with my family's complications. Through the kitchen window, they could see the first floor lights coming on in the main house. Catherine would be awake soon, followed by Thomas. The day that would change everything was beginning in earnest. What about you two? David asked. Where will you go? Elena has job opportunities with engineering firms that work on infrastructure for underserved communities, Maria said. Clean work, using her real skills for people who need them. And I'm going to help coordinate the community response to what we're exposing, Elena added. Make sure the families impacted by Whitmore development have advocates, resources, support systems. What about you, Maria? The question hung in the air like possibility. For the first time in her adult life, Maria faced a future that wasn't defined by other people's needs or emergencies. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I'm going to learn, she said finally, about community organizing, about how to help people without creating dependency, about how to fight systems instead of just surviving them. Elena's been teaching me about financial advocacy, about how to trace money and hold institutions accountable. David smiled, and for the first time since they'd shown him the documents, the expression looked genuine. So you're all becoming professional troublemakers. Professional justice workers, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Troublemakers work alone. Justice workers build community. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Catherine's heels in the hallway. They scattered quickly. David to his carriage house to begin making calls, Elena to the greenhouse to collect her few personal belongings, Maria to her quarters to pack everything she owned back into the 2 worn suitcases that had brought her here. But as she folded her clothes and gathered her mother's photograph, Maria realized she was taking more than she had arrived with. Not material things. Those remained sparse and practical. But understanding, purpose, the knowledge that she could choose principle over convenience and survive the choice. Through her window, she watched Eleanor loading plants into her car. Not ornamental flowers, but vegetables, herbs, things that would feed people rather than impress them. In the distance, David was on the phone, his voice carrying across the morning air as he began the difficult work of offering families honest help instead of convenient solutions. At 8 o'clock, as Thomas and Catherine discovered empty files and missing staff, Maria called the journalists Elena had contacted. By 9, she was sitting in a downtown office, telling her story to people who understood the difference between charity that helped and charity that controlled. The Whitmore estate felt like a memory by the time the sun was fully up, and Maria discovered that freedom weighed much less than security, but somehow filled more space. 6 months later, Maria stood in a community center on Chicago's West Side, teaching a workshop called Understanding Your Financial Rights to a room full of people who looked like her former self, tired, worried, but determined to find solutions to problems that seemed larger than their capacity to solve them. "Banks make money by making you believe you have fewer options than you actually do," she said to the assembled group, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate systems designed to exclude her. "But every financial institution is required to offer certain protections, certain alternatives. The key is knowing what questions to ask." In the back of the room, Elena sat with a notebook, documenting the community's most pressing infrastructure needs. Her new job with a non-profit engineering firm kept her busy designing water treatment systems and sustainable housing for communities that had been overlooked by traditional development. The work paid less than her previous position, but felt like coming home to herself after years of hiding. After the workshop, they walked together to the construction site 3 blocks away, where David's housing project was finally taking shape. The design was simpler than his original plans. Budget constraints had required careful choices, but everything about the development spoke of dignity rather than charity. Playgrounds built by residents, community gardens tended by families who would live there, solar panels installed through a partnership with local technical schools. "Mrs. Rodriguez moves in next week," David said, joining them at the fence that surrounded the construction. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, worn by the reality of building something honest in a system designed to reward shortcuts. Her kids helped design the community room. "How's the funding situation?" Maria asked. "Tight, always tight, but stable." David's smile was tired but genuine. "Turns out, investors who care about communities rather than just profits are harder to find, but easier to work with. We're building fewer units each year, but we're building them right." They watched workers, many of them future residents, installing energy-efficient windows with care that spoke of personal investment rather than hired labor. David had structured the project so that sweat equity could substitute for down payments, creating ownership rather than dependency. "Any word from the trials?" Eleanor asked. "Thomas pled out last month. Financial fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to manipulate housing markets. He'll serve 3 years and forfeit most of his assets." David's voice was matter-of-fact, without satisfaction or bitterness. "Catherine is cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a suspended sentence and community service. She's required to work with housing advocacy groups. How do you feel about that? Like justice is more complicated than I used to think." David adjusted his hard hat, a gesture that had become habitual during months of actual construction work. They did terrible things, but they also genuinely believed they were solving problems. The system that rewarded their methods is still mostly intact. "Systems change slowly," Elena said, "but they do change. Look around." She gestured toward the construction site, but also beyond it, to the community garden that had grown from Eleanor's surplus vegetables, to the financial literacy workshops that had expanded from Maria's initial classes, to the tenant organizing project that helped people understand their rights before they lost them. "It's not just about this development," Eleanor continued. "It's about proving that there are other ways to solve problems. Ways that don't require some people to suffer so others can benefit." Maria thought about her mother, who was thriving on a combination of community health center care and medication assistance programs. The treatment took more coordination than insurance had required, but it came without the weight of obligations Maria couldn't live with. "Speaking of other ways," Maria said, pulling a letter from her bag, "I heard back from the university about the community development program. And," Elena and David said simultaneously, "full scholarship." They want me to study how financial literacy education can be integrated with housing advocacy. Maria's voice carried wonder at still finding herself in spaces where her ideas were valued rather than tolerated. I start in the fall. That's perfect, David said. You'll be able to research what actually works instead of what feels good to donors. What about you? Maria asked Elena. Any thoughts about finishing your graduate degree? I've been thinking about it. There's a program in sustainable infrastructure that partners with community organizations. I could design systems while training local people to maintain them. Elena paused, watching workers carefully measure window placements. Everything I learned about hiding my expertise made me better at sharing it. As the afternoon light slanted across the construction site, the three of them sat on overturned buckets, sharing coffee from thermoses and watching families walk by to check the progress of homes they would soon inhabit. Children pressed faces against the fence, imagining bedrooms and play spaces that would be theirs without the weight of charity or obligation. Do you ever miss it? David asked. The simplicity of the old way, having someone else make the hard decisions? I miss feeling safe, Maria admitted. I don't miss feeling small. I miss the illusion that complex problems had simple solutions, Elena added. I don't miss the guilt of knowing better and staying quiet. I miss believing my family was good people doing good work, David said. Not the romantic notion of home as a place without problems, but home as a space where problems could be faced honestly, where solutions could be built rather than borrowed, where help could be offered without strings that turned gifts into chains. A young girl broke away from her family's evening walk and approached the fence, pressing her face between the bars to get a better look at the construction. Is this where we're going to live? She asked Maria, who was closest to the fence. Is your family on the waiting list? Maria asked. Mama says maybe. I don't miss the willful ignorance that belief required. They sat in companionable silence, three people who had chosen difficulty over comfort and found something in that choice that felt like home. She says it depends on paperwork and luck, and whether we can afford the good luck. The girl's matter-of-fact delivery of adult anxieties struck all three of them silent for a moment. What's your name? Elena asked gently. Sophia. I'm 7 3/4. Mama says I'm old enough to understand that sometimes good things don't happen to people like us, but young enough to hope they will anyway. Maria knelt down to Sophia's eye level, remembering herself at 7, already learning to make space for other people's needs while keeping her own small and quiet. Sophia, what if I told you that good things happen to people like us all the time? They just happen differently than we've been taught to expect. What do you mean? I mean good things that you help create yourself instead of waiting for someone else to give you. Good things that come from working together with your neighbors instead of competing against them. Good things that stay good instead of turning complicated later. Sophia considered this seriously. Like the community garden. Mama says we can grow our own food there. Exactly like the community garden. As Sophia rejoined her family and they continued their evening walk, David, Elena and Maria gathered their things and prepared to head home. Elena to her apartment near the university where she was auditing engineering courses, David to the small house he had rented when he liquidated his trust fund, Maria to the modest place she shared with her mother, who had become an enthusiastic volunteer at the community center. Same time next week? David asked. Every week until the families move in, Maria confirmed. Community building isn't a project with an end date. They walked together toward the bus stop, their conversation drifting to practical matters. Elena's upcoming presentation to the city council about water infrastructure, Maria's research proposal for her graduate program, David's meeting with potential investors who understood that some things mattered more than maximum profit margins. But underneath the practical talk was something else, the quiet satisfaction of people who had found work that felt like purpose, relationships built on choice rather than need, a way of moving through the world that created more possibilities than it consumed. The evening light was soft on their faces as they waited for the bus that would take them back to lives they had built deliberately, carefully, without taking shortcuts that required other people to pay hidden costs. In the distance, the lights were coming on in the Whitmore estate, where new staff worked for new owners, who had bought the property from the court. And probably long after that. Definitely long after that, Elena added. The house looked smaller somehow, less imposing when its power to control their choices had been broken. Maria thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, standing in line at a bank with hope tucked into a manila envelope, believing that her only choice was to accept whatever was offered to someone like her. That woman felt like a different person now, not because her circumstances were necessarily better, but because she had learned the difference between receiving help and building power, between individual survival and collective thriving. The bus arrived, and as they climbed aboard, Maria caught her reflection in the window, a woman who took up space without apology, who asked questions instead of just accepting answers, who had discovered that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight was harder than surrender. Outside, the city stretched towards spring, full of people learning to tend their own gardens, build their own homes, and create good things that belonged to everyone who helped make them possible.